in the blank. You're not getting any younger, so
show up at 100%.
Hey you! Yes, you! Welcome to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast, a podcast for people who want to disrupt their lives for a good reason, to make it count. I'm your host, Jen Glantz, and every week I'll drop a new episode with stories from real people just like you, who woke up one morning and decided to make big changes, starting with small things. We'll cover topics like entrepreneurship, love, failure, and self-care. Hey, you're not getting any younger, so let's make this an adventure. Ready? Hey you, how are you feeling about yourself these days? I always find that as the months count down and the year begins to pack up its things and leave, I start to get mad at myself for all of the things I didn't accomplish and all of the things I wasted time on. Today's episode is all about that voice in your head, the one telling you that you're not good enough, smart enough, or even ready enough to speak up for the things that you want to say and chase after the success that you know you deserve, or take charge of projects that sometimes you doubt you can handle. This week's guest is Alexia Vernon. She's a public speaker, coach, and the author of the book, Step Into Your Moxie, Amplify Your Voice, Visibility, and Influence in the World. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and as always, make sure you subscribe and come hang out with us in the You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group. I always want people to like me. You know, it's what I wake up in the morning and hope for. When I'm in social situations, I'm always thinking, what can I say to make that person like me? And it is such a bad thing to strive for. So I want to ask you, A, is this a popular thing that people strive for? And B, how do I get past that?
Jen, you must be inside my brain, because I had to deal with this very thing probably 45 seconds before I popped on to tape this. And what I mean by that is I knew that I had to have some communication with a team member that felt difficult at first, but I strived to make that a daring conversation. And yes, first of all, it's completely normal, no matter how much moxie we feel like we have. And when I say moxie, I mean our ability to be able to walk into any room or onto any stage and unapologetically speak our truth and know that that will move people to action, whether we feel like we do that a lot or not. Being in that position where we know we might say something that could be triggering for another person, like I think it's still, it's just a very difficult context for all of us. But in terms of a way forward, a couple of things. First, rather than focusing on what you are entitled to say in those moments where you know you want to speak up for yourself, asking instead, what do I want to have happen by the end of this communication? Do I want this person to respect my boundaries? Do I want this person to give me more responsibility, less responsibility, whatever it is? And to really use that as a filter for everything that you're planning to say, so that when you use your words, it's not about like me or don't judge me. It's really about a mutually beneficial exchange between you and that other person. And the second tip I would offer is to pick your words in advance and actually practice them before you either write them or before you speak them. Because most women, we think a lot about what we're going to wear on a given day, what our makeup might look like, what our hair would look like. But how much time do we spend picking up our words and playing with them like produce in the grocery store? We don't do a lot of that. And yet more than anything else we do in our lives, our communication is going to play an impact on whether we get the results that we want or whether we don't get the results that we want. And then the third thing that I would offer in this is, in those moments when we find ourselves really caring about what other people are thinking about us, to give ourselves some grace and recognize that it's normal, and then flip the switch on our self-talk. And rather than saying, am I going to be perceived as smart enough or experienced enough or kind enough or something enough? Am I going to be respected? And since I've done this in my own life, focusing less as a measure of success on how much people like me and instead do people respect me. I find that my ability to navigate through those inevitable, uncomfortable moments has gotten so much easier.
Okay, I think this is super helpful to people out there. When you mention practice, do you mean stand in front of your mirror, say these things out loud? Do you mean role play with a friend? I'm thinking right now, how do I get better at this? So, do I do those things, or do I just start getting myself into situations and flipping that switch and thinking less about what people think of me and more about how they're going to respect me after this is over?
Both. In advance of actually getting out there, actually practicing it aloud. For some people, the mirror is very helpful, or even filming yourself so you can see what your nonverbal communication is doing. For other people, that makes us produce things we would actually never do in a real conversation. You know yourself best. So if recording adds a layer of visibility that's going to make you do wonky things, then leave it alone. But there's something about hearing your words aloud, because communication is supposed to be oral, not just ORAL, but AURAL. Like, we're supposed to hear it. And when we hear our own voice in advance, it makes it so much easier to find our words in a moment because we have the muscle memory of what it is that we want to have come out. And the second, as you said, is to find little ways to buff up these moxie muscles. If we wait to have a negotiation with our dream client and we've never, let's say, gone to a garage sale or showed up at a hotel and seen if we could upgrade for free because we noticed that attendance at that hotel is low, then in those more high stakes situations, we're going to have all the feels because we haven't worked through them in the lower stakes ones.
That's such a good idea, especially trying it out in the situations that matter a little bit less, but then can prove to us that we can do it. Almost like building a tolerance, right?
Yes, exactly.
One thing I notice that happens to me when I speak up for what I believe in, because I think secretly I'm introverted and I used to be a little shy, is that you can see it throughout my body. My face flushes red. I start to shake. I start to I look very, very different than perhaps how I usually look when I'm just going with the flow. Are there things that we can do with our bodies to also portray that moxie, to portray that confidence so that our message is coming across how we really want to say it?
Absolutely. There's things we can do in terms of our self-talk, and then there's things that we can do physically, and then there's things that we can do physiologically. And let me break all of that down. In terms of our self-talk, rather than evaluating ourselves in the moment, which is one of the number one reasons why all those things you talked about, whether it's turning red or feeling like a colony of butterflies is in our chest cavity, being incredibly sweaty, if we don't want those things to happen so prominently, rather than evaluating ourselves, what we can instead say is, how can I connect more with the person I'm speaking with? Because when we focus from thinking about ourselves to thinking about how can we call that person or those people to action, there's no room for ego. There's no room for the self-defeating thoughts, because when we really are focused on impact, we can find our words in any moment where they escape us, because we're back in touch with our intuition, which can only kick in when we're truly present oriented. Now, in terms of managing the sensation, here's my thing about that. For so many of us, we don't use the word sensation, we use the word fear. And when we're in a situation, let's say where there's a snake that's about to bite us, it's okay to say that I'm scared. But in those situations when we're on the cusp of doing something big, or saying something big, it's normal for our heart rate to go up, for us to feel that adrenaline rush, because it means we're playing to our edge, we're stretching, we're growing, we're evolving. So the best thing that we can tell ourselves is, this is normal, I'm grateful that I'm in the game, rather than problematizing it. And then in terms of, okay, so how do we actually shift physiologically what's happening? We can slow down our exhales. Notice I didn't just say slow down our breathing, because oftentimes we can slow our inhales, but if our exhales haven't shifted in terms of rate, we'll just create more of that anxious feeling. In terms of how we take up space, I love the work of Amy Cuddy. I'm sure many of your listeners have seen her TED Talk or have read her book Presence, where she talks about the fact that when we take up more space with our bodies, we actually create the physiological response of confidence. Like we trigger our brains to think we feel more powerful than perhaps if we were our base selves, how we would evaluate we actually felt. And that's a wonderful thing. And it's particularly important for women because as a speaking coach who's worked with women for over a decade, what I can tell you is that most don't lean towards taking up lots of space when they speak. Most tend to speak a little more quietly. And so it's a real opportunity for us to practice being unapologetic about being seen when we communicate our ideas, knowing that it's not just to project confidence to others, but it's to actually feel more confident in the process.
Why do you think that is that women especially don't take up space? Because I've noticed that. I've noticed that with myself sometimes too, is that I will, cower a little bit or cross my body a little bit. Why is it especially with women?
From the moment we are born, we are socialized to want to please, to be liked, to be kind. I have a 4.5-year-old daughter, and I see this already that so much of the praise she gets from not her parents and not our family, but from the outside world is based on whether or not she is perceived to be pleasing to them. Is she cute? Is she polite? Does she wait her turn? And that all gets internalized. And for boys, it's quite the opposite. Oh, he's a great builder, even if a girl is building right next to him. Oh, he is brave because his bravery is based on, his ability to climb the highest on the playground versus a girl's, which might be speaking up to a teacher about seeing an injustice, but that's not necessarily coded as bravery. That's coded as being honest. And so by the time we become adults, a lot of us do what I call bunny tendencies, meaning we are by default trying to be cute and over smiley and not take up too much space. And as a result, we might come across as cute and cuddly. And it's okay if that's a part of who we are, because I think all effective communicators, leaders, business owners are a blend between the feminine and the masculine. But a lot of us don't know how to bring in some of those more masculine qualities of leadership to how we present and argue on behalf of ideas.
That's such a great explanation that I never truly realized, but it's so true. And how do you think, I'm 30 years old. So how do I start to embody more of those masculine tendencies? Do I watch more male speakers? What do I do to take on some of those tendencies that I might not have even realized I was lacking for quite some time?
I always recommend looking at a combination of women and men. And here's why. Because yes, it can be incredibly effective to look at masculine delivery from men. But the truth is how women integrate the masculine in terms of how we talk about money or how we ask for the sale or how we are sometimes disruptive in terms of saying, I respect that this is where you're coming from, but here's how I see it and why. We don't want to do that in a way that feels like we are puffing up and not being our authentic selves. In fact, when we go too masculine, I would actually refer to that as dragon behavior, meaning we're a little fiery. It's our way or the highway. And in society, we know when sometimes women are perceived to be too masculine, they're called a B or slightly less polite terminology. And that's why there are, fortunately, in the era of TED Talks, so many dynamite female speakers who I believe keenly integrate the feminine and masculine, meaning on the feminine side, and this is not about male or female, this is about just qualities of nature, like the yin and the yang, who on the feminine side tell stories and are vulnerable. I'm thinking Brene Brown is a quintessential example of this. And also are unapologetic about articulating their views. And they are flexible in terms of asking for feedback and not being scared of being told that they could do something better. Brene Brown, again, is another example of this. Like, she is very direct. And you see this sometimes even in her social media. When she feels like something is happening in the world that is not right, she says it like it is. Elizabeth Gilbert, to me, another great example of an author and a speaker who handles that navigation really effectively. Shonda Rhimes, I just saw her speak at an event where I was speaking, and a stunning job of being warm and accessible and also indismissible, even if she's sitting down being interviewed.
Wow, you just named a list of people who I strive to be good friends with. So I like that. That's such great advice is to watch wonderful role models like that so that you can really start to see how they are and how you can embody some of their techniques. And I want to talk more about your new book called Step Into Your Moxie. Tell us what the book is about and also what drove you to want to write this.
Great questions. I refer to Step Into Your Moxie as a soul-stirring call to action for women to speak up for themselves and the ideas and issues that matter most to them. Meaning, whether you are looking to slay diminishing self-talk or you're wanting to cultivate the moxie to communicate more powerfully at work, in your business, with your family, in your community, and step into visibility. So for those who are listening who recognize, I want to do more speaking, or I want to be doing media, or I want to be able to ask for more money from my clients if I have my own business, a pathway to be able to do all of those things that is fun, that allows you to be authentically you, just a gussied up version of that. And to your point, or your question rather, of why, oh, in this particular moment in the world, and I promise I won't go into politics here, in the last year alone, since the Me Too movement and Time's Up, every day we are confronted with stories of women who have told their stories on social media, or who have showed up to marches or protests, or who have spoken up at work. But yet it's an altogether different thing to believe that you possess the ability to each and every day self-advocate for yourself and know that your words are consistently moving people to take action on your ideas. And the third piece, that you feel good about who you are showing up as, and you're not spending a lot of your life in your head evaluating yourself. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, for the last decade, I've been working with speakers, some men, but particularly women. And while a lot of my work deals with strategies and techniques to use speaking to grow your business and to have more presence when you're on stage, what I wind up working on more than anything is a lot of the deeper stuff around how women see themselves, whether they are CEOs or whether they are in their first year of business, questioning everything. And always being asked for books that I could recommend, and having lots of books that I love, but never feeling like any were holistic enough to talk about the tactical of communication, but also the deeper stuff, made me realize this was the book I not only wanted to write, but needed to write.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think there's a better time in the world to have a book out there like this. I think a lot of people want to find their moxie, especially people who might not be born with so much moxie. So, what are some tips you have for people who want to speak up, who want to have more moxie in their life?
The first, which is something that we've alluded to already, is find those opportunities to practice. Moxie is a habit, like brushing your teeth or making your bed in the morning. The difference is when you're trying to replace one habit with another one. So let's imagine that you might be someone who often hangs out in the background to see if it's safe and what other people think and feel before expressing your ideas. Then Moxie is actually replacing that habit. And that takes anywhere from 90 to 120 days, which, while we're in those 90 to 120 days, can feel like a really long time. But we know from neuroscience that if we find those daily intentional actions, we make the habit, and then it really does stick with us. A second thing I would offer is, when you find yourself wanting to speak up, rather than starting with the beginning in mind, begin with the end in mind. And this is totally counterintuitive to how most of us plan our communication. But when we begin with, what's the call to action for what I'm about to say? This works for presentations, but it works for an everyday conversation that you're going to have with a colleague. What do I want this person to do by the end of this exchange? And how can I work backwards from that final destination to ensure that everything I say or everything that I ask, everything that I bring up is relevant and towards that end goal? And the third is when you're going into situations where the stakes are high, it feels risky, not everyone would agree. Can you find yourself some champions, people who do have your back, who do see things through a similar worldview, so that you don't feel like you're going at it alone, but you have some support?
I think that those are such incredible pieces of advice, because especially for people who don't find this to be so natural, it really does teach them, okay, this is going to take a little bit of time, so be patient. But also, if you're talking to people who have differing opinions for you, when you think about the outcome, then you're able to approach it in less of a state of aggression and more of a state of assertiveness. Would you say that that's true?
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, I think while we're on the topic of what we say, what about what we say to ourselves? I mean, oh man, I can be guilty of this too, is that sometimes the things I say inside of my head to myself are so completely awful. So, how do we diminish negative self-talk?
In any given moment, most of us have one of three voices going on in our heads. And for a lot of us, we think, well, it's just that voice of the critic. And she is usually most familiar. The critic is always telling us that we're not enough of something. I'm not funny enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not resourced enough. I don't have a big enough network, yada, yada, yada. But it's important to recognize some of the other voices that are there. The other voice that can be there is the voice of the cop. And cops like to make everything into an either or. There is the right career path for me, and there is the wrong career path for me. There is the right thing to say in this situation, and then there's the wrong thing to say in this situation. And the problem when we do those either ors is that we don't play in the gray, really underutilized space between black and white. And the third voice, which I'm also very familiar with, is the voice of the cheerleader. And she is totally a frenemy because on the surface, she sounds great. It's totally cool that you are going to work 18 hours straight today because one day you'll retire and then you can catch up on sleep. Or it's fine that that team member left right before you have a big project that's due. You'll figure it out. You always do. And the problem when we have self-talk that's very cheerleadery is that over time, if we don't address it, we start to get bitter, usually. We get tired, we get sick, we burn out, and we quit. And so recognize any three of those voices holding a microphone in your head. My recommendation is to bring in the voice of the coach. And the coach disrupts that self-talk and turns it from a monologue into a dialogue. Meaning, if you've got the critic going on, the coach is going to ask a question to disrupt that. So if you're thinking to yourself, I'm not experienced enough, you would ask yourself a question like, what's a moment where I have succeeded in the past? And how could I apply what I did then to this situation? Or if you find yourself in the role of the cop doing that either or thing, what does a third or fourth or perhaps fifth option look like? And if you're super cheerleadery, when you bring in the voice of the coach and you ask questions to disrupt that thinking, you might ask yourself something like, what can I let go of? Who can I ask for help? And when we start to acknowledge we're in self-talk that's not productive, and rather than try to silence it, which never works, and talk back to it, we return ourselves to the role of protagonist. And that's incredibly helpful.
I think that those are such practical tips, especially because I think negative self-talk is something that a lot of people experience. And I think that oftentimes we don't know what to do with it except scream at ourselves out loud and say, stop thinking those bad things. So I think that it's great to take on that role of being a coach. And one thing I really like about you and your brand is you help so many incredible people, but you're also very honest about your story too. And I read somewhere that you had a couple of things happen to you in your life where you started to believe that everything happens for you and not to you. Can you
Mhm.
talk more about how you came to think about life that way?
Yes. So I want to fully acknowledge that I am not somebody who was born with buckets of moxie.
Mhm.
As I say, I think it's on chapter one of my introduction. Most of my life, I did truly experience an on again, off again relationship with my own voice. And what I mean by that, and I would bet that a lot of people listening can relate to this, there would be these moments where I felt like I was tap dancing on eggshells, striving to be liked, to give the right answers, to not be called out for failing to be enough of whomever I conjectured other people wanted me to be. But then here's the thing, there would be these other times, confusingly, sometimes in really close proximity to those former times I just described, where I felt almost like a show pony, where I wanted to perform because I had big ideas and I wanted to be heard and I wanted to make impact and I wanted to change the world. And it was really tough to figure out, like, how could I be both of those people? And oftentimes in the moments where I felt like I was disconnected from my moxie, I would really berate myself, particularly once my career was about empowering women to speak up in the world. And one of those experiences for me was postpartum depression. It was at a point where my business had just crossed six figures. I didn't have the 4 hour work week, but I was working like 15, 20 hours a week, netting six figures in my business, figuring like I have the life. I'm with the person that I want to be with. We consciously conceived this child who's coming into the world. And then within less than 3 weeks postpartum, after having a delivery that went way off my birth plan, having the cat that I adored, who was like so much more than a fur baby. I mean, he really felt like my first child, die right as I brought my daughter home from the hospital.
Oh.
I found myself on the floor one morning, like practically catatonic, not able to stand up. And obviously, it didn't just get to this place. It had been several weeks of starting to have panic attacks, not being able to sleep, even though my daughter was sleeping through the night. Um, Having these nightmares where people were attacking my child, being terrified to leave the home, not allowing anyone to see my child for fear that they might get her sick, and that she would stop breathing, like all of these things that in hindsight I now know are quintessential postpartum depression signs. But at the time, initially, all I could say to myself was, I am such a fraud. This experience that was supposed to be so natural and so wonderful has so completely disconnected me from my own voice. And so, how can I help other women reconnect back to theirs? And during that particular low moment I described, where I was just on the ground, I remember seeing this question just appear to me in a download, which was a question that I asked my clients all of the time, but I had yet to ask myself, which was, how might this be happening for me rather than to me? And not trying to answer the question, because like when we have what I refer to as a bum biting moment, you know, one of those moments that just rocks you to your knees and makes you question whether you can get up again, you don't try to answer the question, you just hold space for it. And what I now know, 5 years on the other side of it, is it gave me so much empathy for the people that I coached, in terms of understanding how women who are doing huge things in the world, whether they were doctors or CEOs or entrepreneurs and coaches, when they were questioning themselves too, having had a recent memory of that and knowing what it took to get out of that made me a better coach for them. And in my own life, it helped me realize that as much as we might wish Moxie was a final destination we got to and the habit was firm, because it is a habit, it's a muscle. If you don't continue to flex it, it will atrophy. So I strive to not stay in my business or in my family ever in a role where it's like I'm just coasting for too long, even if it feels comfortable, and rather always look for those stretch opportunities to say more, to serve more, to shake up the status quo in order to grow more.
Wow, thank you for sharing that personal story. I mean, can't imagine going through all of that at once and while running a business, and it just must have been a really tough time. And have you ever felt like it was difficult for you to be vulnerable about the things happening in your life? Because a big part of your job, sort of like mine, is to be there for other people. Was it hard at first to be honest about what was happening to you?
Yes. In that particular moment, it was year one of leading a face-to-face 9-month leadership program. And in the middle of all that, I remember I had to show up and lead a training day for this group of women who were in the year-long cohort, and having to be completely honest about what I was going through, because A, they would have sniffed inauthenticity a mile away, and B, I knew that if I was asking them to tell their stories, I had to be willing to show up and do the same. But for a lot of years as a speaker, I hid behind my funny stories that would make people laugh. And sometimes they would have great aha moments, but they didn't really require me to truly be seen. And I'll never forget one of the first times in front of a professional audience, I integrated a story about having overcome sexual abuse and speaking up as a kid in my family, and having some people in my family believe, like my mom, believe everything that I said and back me up, knowing that there were other people who were not ready for that difficult information that I shared. And much like we've witnessed in recent weeks, being told initially maybe I made it all up, or then when people realized, no, I seemed pretty credible, perhaps I just remembered it wrong and it was another family member and I was confused. And like telling that story and feeling all of the eyes on me, and then obviously integrating it into my message, which was about women and voice and speaking your truth, I definitely felt all of that sensation bubbling up inside of me. But afterwards, there was also just this tremendous feeling of calm that, like, whew, I'm done hiding. I'm done hiding behind fancy pants slide decks when I present. I'm done hiding behind humor that was like secretly getting people to laugh and like me. I'm done pretending like I am this expert who knows it all, and rather I'm a human being. And sometimes I've succeeded, sometimes I've failed. More often than not, it's been somewhere more complicated in between those two poles. And that's what's really going to give people permission in my audiences to try the things I'm saying, to trust me as a person to guide them in that process, and to be graceful with themselves when they find themselves beating themselves up as well for things that they did or did not do.
Wow, I think, you are such an incredible human, and you've taken things that have happened to you and then have used them to help other people. And I think it comes full circle, right? It's about really leading with who you are and your stories and your voice, regardless of what the people around you are going to say or think, because in the end, you have to live with yourself, right? And I think that that's such a beautiful message there. So thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And thank you for giving me and your listeners the space for us to have a really real deep conversation about these issues that so many of us feel like we have to think through on our own.
Yeah.
And it feels very lonely and scary.
Yeah, it feels scary, and it's also important to let people know you're not alone. People go through stuff, and I'm sure you've seen it too when you've been honest about things that you've gone through. People come forward and say, "Yeah, I've experienced something similar," and it brings you together, it builds those relationships that really matter in life as well.
Yes, when we tell our stories, it gives other people permission always to tell theirs.
Nothing is more important than that, I think, especially these days. So thank you for reminding us of that. I have one more final question for you.
Hit me
Fill,
lovingly.
fill in the blank. You're not getting any younger, so
Show up at 100% and perform at 100%, because this is the one precious life we have. So why not play full out?
oh, I love that so, so, so much. Alexia, thank you so much for talking with us today. Can you please tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and, of course, your new book?
Yes. So for folks who want to connect with me, alexiavernon.com is my website. And if you want to order your copy of Step Into Your Moxie and let every person you've ever met know about it, I'm kidding. No, I'm not. You can learn more about the book at stepintoyourmoxie.com. You can order it on Amazon, go to Barnes & Noble.
Amazing. And we'll link to all of that on our website, anyyounger.com. Alexia, thank you so much again. We wish you the best of luck, and thank you for all your amazing advice today.
Thank you, Jen.
Hey, you. Thank you for listening to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast. There are hundreds of thousands of pods out there, so thank you for listening to this one. You can find the show notes for this week's episode up on our website, anyyounger.com. Subscribe, rate, and review the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast on iTunes so that other ears around the world can listen too. Oh, and join our secret You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group, where over 1,000 people are talking about how to disrupt their lives, for a good reason, to make it count. Until next week, all my love, Jen Glantz.